Welcome to the Comeback Team podcast. We're in Orlando again. Once again, I'm pleased and proud to introduce Dr. Tom Fisher, esteemed senior professor at University of Central Florida's Exercise Physiology and Science program, editor of Muscle Media magazine, and just all-around world-class sports psychologist. So, you know, we've talked about different things. We talked about mental toughness. We've talked about, you know, getting into the foundational aspect of our psyche as it relates to sports. You know, I think we're going to focus on this one, on athletics and limits. You know, and how do we define limits, limitations, the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about risk, the way we think about risk adversity. And I think we've got a certifiable expert in all of this foundational material. And, you know, Tom, thank you again. It's a pleasure having you.
My pleasure.
And
Thanks
I've
for having me.
learned so much from our outtakes. You know, I don't know if we're going to have any outtakes of some of these talks.
We should have had the cameras rolling just while
just
we were
for
sitting here.
the jiu-jitsu versus Korean Kung Fu and everything else that he's a grandmaster at. So, but yeah, you know, when it comes to limitations, you know, you said something earlier about limits versus limitations. Yes. And I think that in and of itself, I hate to make you repeat it, but for our community,
no, I think it's important because people like to think about testing their limits. The fact is, well, a couple of things need to be said. Most people live unexamined lives, which is a tragedy in its own right. But to think that you're going to be willing to examine your limits is it's probably a bit heady and a bit ambitious. I always tell my students out at the university that the responsibility of a coach or a trainer is to have your athlete, have your patients examine their limitations, and here the differentiation needs to be made. Limits are physics. Limits are physics. You're out of it. That's it. No more air, no more water, no more this, no more ATP. Boom. And survival is at stake then. Limitations, on the other hand, are self-imposed. And these are the things that are fragile, and they are, for the most part, because people live unexamined lives, they tend to be established arbitrarily, simply because no situation or circumstance in their life has had them necessarily extend themselves beyond that self-imposed limitation. Now, relative to each other, limitations are right here. Limits are way over there. And this artificial touchstone or waypoint, I think is what you'd call it, is subject to question. And being military, one of the things that we both experienced was boot camp, basic training. And what the drill instructors were charged to do was to have you go out and explore those self-imposed limitations. And I don't know anybody who's ever come out of boot camp who wasn't surprised that they did more than they thought they were capable of. Right. And you see, that's the whole bleeding point, as they say. And once you do that, once you establish that you can go beyond, that triggers something.
It really does.
This is no longer set in stone.
Exactly.
The problem is that people get caught up in the language and they're casual with the language, inappropriately so. Right. So when they start to talk about limits, they should really be talking about the self-imposed limitations, because I got news for you. Unless the circumstances are extraordinary, you're not going to go out and press your limits. You're just not going to do it. Self-preservation is going to take over, and you're going to shut down.
Yeah. Would you say it's more psychological or physical as far as the limitations that have been set by the individual?
I think because the people live unexamined lives, they have never taken their physical. See, here this brings up a whole different series of discussions. And again, I'm a stickler for the language.
If you don't mind me interrupting, could you explain to the community exactly what you mean by examined lives versus unexamined lives?
Oh, sure. I usually talk in terms of introspection. One of the things that I necessarily mandate, you come to see me, you keep a journal, a daily journal. I'm good at what I do, but I can't be accountable for everything. And it's up to you to start to learn where you're doing things correctly, when you're making mistakes and whatnot, and put them down. Part of what keeps people up at the proverbial 4 a.m. looking at the ceiling fan is that they don't write things down. And they like to think that whenever they leave off a thought, they're going to come right back and pick up where they left off. No, they're not. They're going to go right back to the very beginning and get back into that Mobius. Having an examined life is keeping track of things. It's being accountable.
Mindful, basically.
Mindfulness, yes, yes. And it's such a valuable tool. To have things written down, because it's a multi-sensory marking here. You think it, you write it, you read it. So there's a number of senses, and it becomes imprinted. Far more than just musings. You know, just thinking about it. Okay. That's not enough. It's insufficient. And frankly, the higher up you go in the hierarchy, the more critical it is.
Oh yeah.
You know, there's less room for error.
Yep.
Fewer mistakes.
So right off the bat, I mean, if you're trying to manage expectations and limitations, the more mindful, the more of an examined life you live, the more capable you're going to be of transcending your limitations, right?
Well, yeah, and then you get into expectations versus outcomes.
Right.
See, people are disappointed with their outcomes, and let's just keep it in the athletic arena for the time being.
Okay.
But athletes go in any competition, they've probably got a history, and if they're honest with themselves, they know what their history is. It's either going to be a positive or a negative, and when they go in there, they have certain expectations as to what's going to happen. Well, if they failed, they're going to be upset. And if they repeatedly become disappointed, it's not the outcomes. They need to go back and re-examine their expectations. Perhaps they're unduly high. You need to re-examine this rather than getting upset over here with, for all intents and purposes, that's fact. Expectations are fiction.
Right.
Well, you mentioned something before, talking about when you go to boot camp or buds or what have you, you know, that you experience some things physically that prepare you mentally in a way that without having experienced those physical challenges that you wouldn't achieve. And I learned, I guess, this behavior through my own sport and my own training, not in a book, but I always say to my athletes now, you get your mental toughness through your physical challenges. So, you know, there's nothing that's going to make you respond differently than really putting a physical stress on your body to demand a response. And we talked about in a previous podcast that I had done log PT with the Navy SEALs out in San Diego. 55-degree water, 400-pound log, 5 people working together trying to make it happen.
The boat?
You know, and and the instructor said, "Who can't swim?" 2 people raised their hand and said, "Well, you better hold on to that log tight then, because we're going to swim this log around this quarter mile around this island, and we're going to bring it back." And so, but what I experienced was this, and it goes back to your expectations. Randy Hetrick from TRX, who created TRX. He looked at me before this thing started and he said, he laughed, he said, "TA, you're gonna get hammered today." And I said, "Why you say that, Randy?" He said, "Because the tall guy always gets hammered." And I was like, but in a very strange way, in a very exciting way, it prepared me in that moment to go, you know what, whatever it is, and I told him, whatever it is, I'm ready for it, let's go. Had I not had that type of an expectation, maybe I would have approached this entire thing a little bit differently. And when it was over, was it one of the hardest things, absolute hardest things I've ever done? 100%. But in a weird way, something switched,
valuable.
just like you said, and I wanted to do it the next day.
Yeah.
At a burning desire. My body was sore, it was scratched up, I was, waterlogged, but I wanted to do it again the next day. And I think that you take yourself to the limits of what you consider to be your limits again and again and again, and you continue to push that limit a little bit higher. And I'm sure you teach from that perspective at some level or another, and explain what is, not just from the athlete perspective, because I think we have a more, as Chuck said earlier, like a non-competitive athletes than we do people out there trying to compete for a medal. How would you speak to that environment?
Well, a couple of things come readily to mind. The first part of the human tragedy and the human condition is that we only know what we know.
Sure.
That's all we know. You see, and when we like to think that we're speaking from experience, you really can't. If you read it in a book, that's one thing.
Yes.
But matter of fact, Master Musashi in the Book of Five Rings said, you must practice this assiduously, you must practice. In other words, it's not enough to just talk about it, dream about it, watch others do it. No, you must take, in his case, sword in hand.
Right.
But there's a certain willingness to entertain things beyond. Because we only know what we know, the more experiences that you have, and this is a conversation that we were having here just a few moments ago, prior to the shoot, was experience is invaluable. They say you can't buy experience, and that's very, very true. But experience will teach you, because experience, you add experience and knowledge. Those two things lead to wisdom.
Wisdom, yes.
And that's invaluable.
No doubt.
And the more opportunity you go out and the more opportunities you take you take advantage of, the more your experiential base, $1 billion phrase here, what I mean by that, it's your web of experiences.
No, absolutely.
It's all the things that you've got, so that when you encounter something new, a new situation, a new scenario, you can look at it and you've already got experiences back here. You've got many, and several of them might be very, very similar, and they've already run their tendrils, so they're already interrelated. So you're more or less prepared. Sure. You can predict what's going on. If you don't have any experiences, you've got one or two. Right. Every new experience that you encounter is going to be you reinventing a wheel. You have nothing to fall back on.
Right.
Well, here's the academic justification for the podcast a few episodes ago, where we talked about commitment to participate. Everything he just said echoes that attempt at an academic level, because we know that the diversity of performance, the diversity of experience, the wisdom that you earn both intellectually and physically prepare you for your ultimate next setback.
And our good friend Guillaume said just earlier today, he said that sometimes you look back at stuff that you did 10 years ago and you go, wow, that was some good stuff I was doing. It's almost like, and I heard an older educator say one day, I've forgotten more things than this young man knows, a good know-it-all kid.
Yes.
And I thought about that, what he said, but then I went, wow, the fact that we have forgotten some of the things maybe that brought us success in the past, because times do change, right? We came up in a different era, no social media, no digital this and that, and we were bartering with the person that's at the radio station to get some advertising, and then you're training the guy who makes the business cards. Like in my business, that's how I bootstrapped it and came up through the ranks. But when you start realizing there were some really valuable teaching points and moments that you had, several years back, that if we're not careful, they go away. And so to your point, just being deliberate, have a specific intention on recalling that web that you just discussed of information and knowledge to create that wisdom, I think is so valuable, not just for coaches and educators and guys like us, but it's valuable for us with our personal physical experiences to remember where we've been.
Tia, you just mentioned a word there, deliberate. And matter of fact, I do a lecture on this out at the university about being a deliberate individual rather than sitting on the fence or being indecisive or whatnot. There's good and bad here because the way it ties in, the more experiential base you have, the more of these little frames of reference that you've acquired over the years and leads you to have this experience, the more you're able to take risks, the more you're able to be deliberate,
right,
and make a decision. And I'm reminded here, we were just talking a few moments about the art of war of General Sun Tzu.
Sure.
And one of his tenets is, in war, what matters most is extraordinary speed. Right. And when I was a little boy and I was reading that, I always thought, you had to run fast. Well, that's part of it, but that's not really what he was saying. He's really talking about the ability to make a decision.
Reaction.
To do something.
Right. Let me ask you this then, on that, let it be if it's going back to rehab that we talked about earlier, or if it's a recreational athlete, or if it's a competitive athlete, and we talk about limitations. Limitations, at least what I came away with, could either be physical or it could be what we set ourselves psychologically.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, do you see better results, or is there such a thing, as does evidence show? Can we mentally prepare to break through our limitations, which will then help us physically, or do we have to go through the physical first to break through the limitation, so we know psychologically I can do that, or I will be better, or I've experienced it? Because let me just throw one more thing out there, and that's imagery. How many times have we competed in, let it be if it's any walk of life or an athletic event, the fact that we've been there before, I'm prepared for it mentally. I know what to expect. But in this case, if we're pushing a limitation that we may not know what we don't know, which drives which? The psychological or the physical? Or is it both ways?
Yes. Yeah, and that's not me in the middle of the road here. Please let me explain that. Because in psychology and psychobiology and physiological psych, whichever avenue you wish to take, there are a couple of different ways to look at things. You can say lead the body and the mind will follow, or you can lead the mind and the body will follow. And that's better stated, or differently stated, when you believe it, when you see it, then you will believe it, as opposed to when you believe it, then you will see it. You see, now, an excellent argument could be made for both of those, because I think right now you're flipping through your mental Rolodex and you're going, well, wait a minute, I remember that time that, yeah, well, okay, you see, because you've done both. But most people get sidelined, and most people are tangibly oriented, so they will only believe it when they see it. And they never extend beyond that, and that's part of that examined life.
Well, you know, when we were talking about this earlier also, and to community members, you know, in clinical practice, you know, I treat people with god-awful spinal disorders, and most of the time it's at the level of surgical intervention. And then there's all the holistic and wellness and recovery that goes along with that. And that's what all of this speaks to. And we were talking about the role of sports psychology. And, you know, there's this fundamental mistake out there in society to think that if you are looking inward emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, that in some way you're weak, or you have a hole in you, or it's shameful, or it's stigmatized. And you know, I just want to use this opportunity to, one, thank you for doing what you do, and two, to reassure absolutely everybody I'm talking to now and everyone that I will see in the future to understand it is more than okay to examine your innermost self and to examine your emotional and spiritual and philosophical self. In fact, not only is it okay, it's optimal. And there are esteemed experts out there all the time. When I refer someone I care about in my spine surgery practice to a high-level psychologist, it's not because I think they're crazy, which ends up sometimes being parroted back. It's because I think they have opportunities for personal growth and wellness. And so one of the things I'm thrilled about having Dr. Tom here is to convey this message and to share the value of expanding your own mental wellness, not disease. This is not about the negative. No. This is about the opportunity and the wellness and the optimization of the preventative health that is intrinsic to your physical health and your capability health and your functional performance. And, you know, speak to that. I know you say you take care of a large group of your people are people who want it for performance. They have a goal. How do you pivot those people who aren't quite sure why they're there?
Break it into immediate goals. Oftentimes we set goals that are way off. You know, what did parents usually say? You know, aim for the stars, and even if you don't make it, you'll hit the moon. You know, fall short. But anyway, it does give you something to aspire to. And as a matter of fact, I'm a great proponent of a short-term goals. But then again, also using the journal, because then you can keep a record of those.
Of your
so
growth.
You don't just get into that mindset of this isn't doing any good, because then you can go back and review a litany, a history of successes.
Well, part of it, that is, look, maybe you had a great week 3 weeks in a row, then you had a bad week, and you looked at, if you are journaling properly, you could see, what did I not do this week that I had those other 3 weeks? That, you know, what was different, and what did I do differently or better? And from my understanding, you know, from the high-level study aspect of sports psychology and mental conditioning, what I've recognized one of the biggest values is to be about the routine, right? And to me, everything that you're saying, okay, journal. Well, that's a routine. I have to put myself into a routine for success, right? If we're talking to golfers, well, there's a very specific routine. If you go up to the ball differently every single time, how can you expect to be consistent in any single aspect of the game?
Exactly.
Right? So if we can dial ourselves into a process, right? I know Chuck's really good about this, especially as it relates to movement. He says, we're going to do these 5 exercises every single day to prepare the body to perform, because these are the things, if we go through this routine, it's going to turn on all the right switches, it's going to have the proper activation, and we're setting ourselves up for success. Have you seen that the routine aspect, right, to be one of the biggest aspects of what you do, or is that just one of the many components?
Well, it's one of the many components, but Chuck mentioned visualization. It's part of that whole thing. And all of my athletes have their own pre-shot. Baseball players go over and they hit both of their, before they approach the plate, they hit the home plate twice, they knock the dirt off their shoes even though there's no dirt, but they go through this, they doop, 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 doop.
Roughing the doll.
That's, I mean,
absolutely.
and tennis players too, they bounce the ball twice, they've got 2 tennis balls in each pocket, that kind of thing. It has to be, and matter of fact, being pilots are among the most superstitious people I've ever met. And
Checklist.
You've got to go through the checklist. And when you do a pre-flight, in other words, you're looking at the aircraft, you do a walk around. If in the middle of the walk around, crew chief comes over and interrupts you,
Start over.
you got to start over again. You can't just pick up where you left off and go. No, you start over again. It partly superstition, and the other part is, no, this is order, because while I'm going, I'm mentally going through and emotionally going through my mission, and I know what to do. And by the time I sit down in that cockpit, I'm ready to rock.
I know what I did in sports prior to ball games, and it was the same thing over and over. It became my belief system. It got me mentally and physically prepared, which is similar to what you just described with the pilot.
And emotionally.
And emotionally prepared, no question. One thing I see with athletes, and TA, you may see this too, is that very often athletes will change training systems. And it's usually the athletes that are still on the ascent or having difficulty trying to establish themselves anyway, because it's not them that's the problem, it's the system.
Seminaritis. I just went to this seminar and it's the greatest thing, everything gets trashed, and now this is the
But
way
what they have to understand is, what are the foundations to get them better? What is the system that's going to make me better? Now, there isn't one system that is universal for all. There's, I believe, certain principles that are universal. That's what the good Lord gave us when we talk about movement. But there's certain systems or certain principles that are consistent. And if those systems are built around it, now it becomes a belief. And what we have to do is, for those athletes, believe in the system and stick with it for a while, rather than trying to find that holy grail that they're just not staying with one system, and that system becomes their belief or becomes their ritual and preparation.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that tinker around, and I understand excellence, you know what I mean, and wanting to have a little bit more. I've worked with people that have been #1 in the world, and while they were #1 in the world, just changed everything and went a different direction with limited success. I've had people that didn't have anything going on, and they came over to us and they were able to ascend. I've had people that have come with nothing, ascended, and as soon as they started to achieve, as Chuck just said, a little bit of success, decided to change something because they wanted even more success and dropped off because the routine wasn't there anymore.
That's evolution, the need to evolve, because your performance, particularly at a high level, changes the game. The Moneyball concept. Comeback team community, thank you for joining us in Orlando with Dr. Tom Fisher. We're very grateful to have had you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And anyway, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. We'll keep coming back with more content as we try to teach you how to be the best you can be forward. Thank you.